Welcome everyone to another exciting event from the Cambridge Festival. It's my great pleasure today to be introducing my colleague Ali Boyle. Ali is a philosopher who works at the Leverhulme Centre for the Future of Intelligence on the Kinds of Intelligence programme, with an emphasis on non-human minds, memory and imagination. The Leverhulme Centre for the Future of Intelligence is an interdisciplinary community of researchers founded in October 2016, which is dedicated to making the best of the opportunities and challenges offered by AI in the decades to come. Today, Ali is going to be talking about imagining things and the interesting and complex relations between imagination and memory. Two minor quick points of order. First is that closed captions are available. I'm sure some of you are already seeing them at the bottom of your screen. And the second is that we're going to be having a few minutes for Q&A at the end. But if you want to ask questions during the talk, you can just type them into the Q&A box and we'll choose as many as we can to discuss at the end of the talk. So without further ado, please, Ali, take it away.
Okay, thanks Henry for that wonderful introduction. And thanks all of you for coming. So as Henry said, I work on a program at CFI called Kinds of Intelligence. And at Kinds of Intelligence, we're interested in all sorts of questions about the different kinds of minds that exist, or the different kinds of minds that could exist. So obviously, because we're an AI research centre, one of the things we're interested in is the minds of current and future artificial intelligences and how they compare to human minds. But we're also interested in questions about the minds of animals, from really simple to really complex animals, and even in sometimes some wackier questions about whether plants or bacteria have minds. And when we get together and start to think about this vast spectrum or space of possible minds, we often find ourselves circling back around to one thought. And that thought is that humans are kind of weird. So by saying that humans are weird, I don't necessarily mean anything negative. It's just that we do a lot of things that are kind of unusual when you compare our behavior to the behavior of other creatures. We do things like build skyscrapers, make cars, construct economies, we build roads and pedestrian crossings, and we enact road traffic laws and we follow them. And when we look at the behavior of all the other creatures that exist, these all look like kind of strange ways of behaving. And I think it's natural to think that these weird behaviors reflect something kind of weird about the human mind, that the human mind itself might be strange in a number of ways. And I'm interested in the ways in which the human mind is strange or unique. And one thing that I think is strange and potentially unique about the human mind is that we have this capacity to imagine things. We have the imagination. So what do I mean by the imagination? I mean, more or less what you would think. We think about the imagination as this place in our minds where we can explore a vast range of possibilities. So in your imagination, you can kind of travel mentally to far off and even mythical places. Right now, you could imagine yourself walking through a rainforest, or standing on top of a mountain, walking with dinosaurs, or even sailing with pirates. But imagining things can also be kind of less interesting and exciting than that. It can be less pleasant too. So sometimes you can find yourself having really intrusive and unpleasant imaginings. Like if you have something coming up, like a job interview or a test, you might find yourself imagining all the ways in which it could go wrong. And we can also imagine really boring things. Like if I asked you to, you could probably imagine something like making a cup of tea. Like you could imagine all of the steps you would go through. You could picture the cup and the kettle and hear the sounds that the kettle makes and the clink of the spoon, and maybe even feel the steam on your face in your mind's eye. And these are all the sorts of things you can do with your imagination. So when you start to think about the imagination and all the things we can imagine, it starts to look kind of weird that we have this ability. You might think, what's the point in having this ability to mentally wander off to far off places or imagine things like making a cup of tea? And we do often talk about people having their heads in the cloud as though it's a bad thing. So we might think, well, wouldn't it be better just to be kind of present, focused in the here and now, rather than having our minds wander off into these imaginary scenarios? So from that perspective, it's kind of puzzling why we have this capacity to imagine. So one way to try and make a bit of progress with understanding why we have the imagination or what it's for is to ask, well, what good is it? What can we do because we have the ability to imagine things that we wouldn't be able to do or wouldn't be able to do as well without it? And that's a big and complicated question, and it might have lots of answers because there might be lots of things that the imagination enables us to do. But the thing I'm going to talk about today is maybe a surprising idea, which is that the imagination is really deeply involved in our ability to remember. So to illustrate that, I want to start by talking about a phenomenon that I think makes the connection between imagination and memory really clear and really vivid. And that is a technique known as a mind palace. So I'll start by saying something about what mind palaces are. So it's quite possible that if you've heard of mind palaces at all, that you heard of them through the BBC TV series Sherlock. And if you haven't seen it, there are a couple of scenes in Sherlock in which Sherlock is trying to puzzle out some really troubling or tricky aspect of a case. And he announces, "I'm going to my mind palace." And then he closes his eyes and some animations pop up on the screen as though we're seeing what's going on in his mind. And more often than not, those animations are bits of text, like names of people or places involved in the case or other things like that. And Sherlock kind of somehow mentally moves these things around until suddenly he's cracked the case, he's able to solve the problem. And so if that's all you knew about mind palaces, I think that would give you a certain kind of impression about what mind palaces are and what they're for. And that impression would be something like this. So firstly, it seems that Sherlock uses his mind palace to solve puzzles, to solve mysteries. So you might think, well, that's what a mind palace is for. Secondly, it seems as though Sherlock's mind palace is full of words. So you might be left thinking that whatever a mind palace is, it involves doing something with words. And thirdly, at least as it's presented in the series, it looks kind of complicated and difficult to use a mind palace. And you might be left with the impression that it's the kind of thing you could only use if, like Sherlock, you were a genius. So perhaps, unsurprisingly, because it's TV, more or less everything about this is wrong. A mind palace is actually a really simple and straightforward image-based technique that people use not to solve puzzles, but to remember things. Ancient Greek orators used to use them to remember their speeches. And today, memory champions who compete in competitions to see who can remember the most stuff, they use mind palaces to remember really huge bits of information, like remembering pi to hundreds of decimal places. And you don't have to be a genius to use a mind palace. So scientists have studied these memory champions, and they found that those people aren't any smarter than the rest of us. They're just really good at using mind palaces, and that's something that takes a bit of practice. Okay, so what actually is a mind palace? At its most basic, a mind palace is just a place that you imagine. So it could be somewhere fictional that you dream up in your head, or it could be somewhere that you're familiar with from real life, but that you can kind of bring to mind in your imagination. And it can be almost any place at all. There are just two requirements that you have to have before your place can be a mind palace. The first is that it has to have a root, and the second is that it has to have slots. So that's to say basically that your mind palace, your place that you choose for your mind palace, it has to have some kind of path through it that you'll remember, that you can kind of walk through in your mind's eye. And secondly, there need to be slots, which basically I'll say a bit more about, but that basically just means places where you could kind of mentally put something, put a piece of information. So that's kind of abstract. But here's a kind of real life example of something that I could use as a mind palace. So back in the before times when we used to go to work, I had an office in the city centre, and some days I would walk to work. So I could use part of that route that I used to take to work every day that's really familiar to me as my mind palace. And I used to walk down Trinity Street. So I could use a section of Trinity Street as my mind palace. So let's say that I'm going to do that. I could say that my mind palace starts here at the top of Trinity Street, outside Pocket Watch and Petticoats, and it continues on down the street past All Saints Garden, down past Heifers, and then continuing all the way down to the Cambridge University Press bookshop. So this is a place, a real place as it happens, but it's a place that I can imagine. And there's a really clear route through the place from the top of Trinity Street down to the bottom. And along the way, there are lots of places where I could kind of mentally put something. There are all of these little doorways or openings to little side streets or gardens. And these are what I'm going to use as my slots. So, okay, so this is my mind palace. If you've got a place like this that has a route and some slots, you've got a mind palace too. So what do you do with it? Well, you use it to remember things. So let's say that I want to remember the names of all of Taylor Swift's albums in the order in which they were released. So what I need to do is just head to the first slot in my mind palace, which is here outside Pocket Watch and Petticoats. And I just need to place something in my first slot, some image that I associate with Taylor Swift's first album. So Taylor Swift's first album was called Taylor Swift. So I just need an image that I associate with Taylor Swift. The name Swift, it means fast, runners are fast. So I'm going to say that I associate a runner with this first album. And I'm going to put an image of a runner in my first slot. So now that I've done that, I just move on to my second slot and I place an image that I associate with the second album. So the second album was called Fearless, and I associate lions with fearlessness. So I'm going to put a picture of a lion in my second slot, which is this empty shop front. Now I move on down to my third slot at the Old Divinity School, and I need to put something that I associate with Taylor Swift's third album, which was called Speak Now. And that reminds me of the part in the Christian wedding ceremony when they say, speak now or forever hold your peace. So I'm going to put an image of some wedding rings here in this third slot. And then onto the fourth slot, where I'll put something that I associate with the fourth album, which was called Red. And roses are red. So I'll put a rose here at the entrance to All Saints Garden. And I would just carry on in this way, putting in an image that I associate with each album into the next slot until I'm left with something like this. And now when I want to remember Taylor Swift albums, I should be able to do that by just revisiting my mind palace in my imagination. So I should be able to bring Trinity Street back to mind. And when I get there, I should find the runner in the first doorway, the lion in the second doorway, the rings in the third doorway, and so on. And seeing all of these images should prompt me to remember the names of the albums: Taylor Swift, Fearless, Speak Now. And that is basically all there is to it. So it takes a little bit of practice to get good at it. And you can make your mind palace bigger and more complicated, but those are the basic building blocks of a mind palace. You just need a place that you can imagine with a route and some slots, and you place some images in it that you associate with the stuff that you want to remember. So the point of telling you all this is partly just that it's kind of cool. And now you should be able to go away and build your own mind palace and remember all kinds of impressive things and do well in pub quizzes. But it also might, I think, give us a clue about that puzzle I raised about the imagination. Like, what good is the imagination? What does it do for us? And I think mind palaces give us a clue about that, because a mind palace is just a way of using your imagination to hack your memory. And what I mean is that you can use your imagination to remember more things than you would otherwise be able to remember. So obviously, we aren't all building mind palaces all the time. So that can't be what the imagination is for. It's not for building mind palaces. But it might be that mind palaces work because they exploit a more kind of basic fact about the imagination, a more basic role that it plays in memory. So to talk a bit more about the relationship between the imagination and memory, it helps to start by saying that there are a few different types of memory. And one really important distinction is between memory for facts and memory for events. And we know that remembering facts and remembering events are two different kinds of psychological processes, and they happen in different bits of the brain. And we know that because they can be selectively impaired, which is just a kind of fancy way of saying that you can damage one type of memory without damaging the other type of memory in the same way. So for instance, when people suffer from amnesia, they lose their ability to remember events and they lose a lot of their existing event memories, but they often retain a lot of general knowledge. They remember facts like the meanings of words, their times tables, the capitals of the world and things like that. So when we use a mind palace, clearly we're primarily concerned with that first type of memory, that second type of memory, factual memory. And mind palaces help us to remember facts, I think, by addressing two kinds of problems that we face when we try and use our factual memory. And these problems are, I think, probably familiar to all of us because we've all had to study at some point for a test or an exam and try and learn and memorize facts. And so we know that doing that can be kind of difficult. And there are a couple of different ways in which it's difficult. So the first thing is, when you sit down and study for a test, it can just be really difficult to get facts into your memory. It can be really difficult to get them into your brain. Now, why is that? That's difficult because when you can think of your factual memory, not just as a list of things that you know, but as a really complex, interconnected web of information in which everything that you know is connected to lots of other things. So that if I asked you, for instance, what the capital of France is, you wouldn't just remember that it was Paris, but you would also activate lots of other pieces of knowledge you have about Paris and France. You might suddenly remember something about the Eiffel Tower or the Eurostar or other things. And when we learn something new, we're not kind of just trying to add another thing to the list of things that we know. We're trying to get a piece of information into its right place in that complex web of facts. And that process just is kind of slow and difficult. But the imagination gives us a kind of shortcut by enabling us to store bits of information before we've properly integrated them into that complicated web. Because in the imagination, we can kind of manufacture or manipulate or create associations where they didn't exist before. So I can kind of stick a bit of information in my mind by associating it with something else in my imagination. So in my mind palace, I'm doing that by associating all of my album names with some images, and then those images with a familiar place. But we can also do it in smaller ways as well. We can make information more memorable by associating it with other things in our imagination. So that's one thing the imagination does for us. That's one thing it's good for. It helps you get facts into factual memory. But there's a second problem we come up against when we're trying to remember facts, which is that as well as it being sometimes quite difficult to get facts into your memory, it can then be quite difficult to get them out. So I'm sure we've all had this phenomenon where you've definitely learned something. Maybe you're trying to remember the meaning of a particular word or a place or something, but you just can't get hold of it. Like maybe it's on the tip of your tongue, but you just can't get it out. And in those cases, what you need is what psychologists call a cue or a prompt, something that you associate with the thing you're trying to remember and which is going to trigger you in remembering it. And sometimes those prompts or cues, they come from the world or from people around you. Maybe you see or hear something that reminds you of what you're trying to remember. But what the imagination does is it gives you the power to prompt your memories from within. so you don't have to rely on the world giving you prompts and cues. And a mind palace is a really powerful example of that, because all of those images in my mind palace, what they're doing is just prompting me to remember the names of albums by showing me something that I associate with them. But there are also like much less dramatic ways to do this with your imagination without building a mind palace. So for instance, if I asked you to name as many kitchen utensils as you possibly can, or as many things found in a kitchen, more than likely what you would do is imagine yourself in your kitchen, and that would prompt you to remember loads more things that are found in a kitchen than you would otherwise be able to remember. So as well as helping you to get things into your memory, your imagination also helps you get them out. So these are a couple of big ways, I think, in which the imagination is involved in our ability to remember facts. But remember that I said there was another type of imagination, memory for events. And research actually suggests that the imagination is even more deeply involved in our ability to remember events. So the interesting thing about remembering events is that it uses exactly the same brain areas as imagining things. And we know that because unlike factual memory and event memory and imagination can't be selectively impaired. So if you damage someone's ability to remember events, if someone suffers from amnesia, they will also be unable to imagine things. And in a way, this kind of connection between remembering events and imagining things is maybe not that surprising. So if you think about your own experience of remembering events and of imagining things, there's something that feels very similar about those processes. They both involve a kind of picturing things in your mind. But what's maybe surprising is that some researchers have gone as far as to say that there's really no fundamental difference at all between imagining and remembering events. So they say things like, remembering events is just imagining the past. Of course, so what they mean by that is not that when we remember things, we're completely making it up. What they mean is that we're drawing on bits of information to construct an image in our mind's eye about what happened in the past. So that is a kind of imagining the past that is anchored in some stored bits of information. But that's also true of other types of imagining. So remember, I talked earlier about imagining how to make a cup of tea. If you imagine how to make a cup of tea, you're also constructing a mental image based on bits of stored information. And so what these people mean when they say that remembering events is just imagining the past is just that exactly the same thing is going on in both cases. You're using stored bits of information to construct an image, and that just is imagining. And that suggests that the imagination might not just be involved in our ability to remember facts, but also in our ability to remember our past. And if we didn't have the ability to imagine, we might not have that ability to remember the past at all. So this takes me back round to that puzzle that I raised in the beginning about why we imagine things. And what I've been suggesting is that if we look at this memory research and at mind palaces, memory is a big part of the answer. The imagination is really deeply involved in our ability to remember things. And that, in a way, I think is kind of paradoxical, because we think about the imagination, as I said, as this capacity that enables us to travel great distances from the here and now and explore other possible worlds. But it also is really deeply involved in our ability to remember facts about this world and to remember our own histories. And so, as well as enabling us to engage in flights of fancy, the imagination also keeps us grounded in reality. And that's the end of my talk.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for that fantastic talk, Ali. We've got a few minutes now for questions, and I notice we've already had some in the chat. But if anyone has any questions they would still like to ask, we'll see how many we can get through. So the first question, Ali, comes from Irene Hannasand, who asks, does everybody's mind use visual imagery as the best symbolism to store and recall memory?
That is a great question. So I think there's a lot of individual difference when it comes to both imagination and memory. So the straightforward answer would probably be no. So there are some people who report not having any kind of visual mental imagery at all. They have, I don't know if we'd call it a condition, but a characteristic that's called aphantasia, which just means the inability to imagine. And one thing that I think is really interesting is to think about whether that has any impact on their ability to remember things, which, as far as I know, is something that hasn't been studied yet. So this is I think, yeah, the simple answer is no, but there's a more complicated answer, which we don't know yet because we haven't yet, I think, done enough research into the individual differences.
Great, thank you. A question from Elizabeth Jordan now. Are there any significant differences between memory and imagination that operate visually and those that use sounds, touch, or smell? So I guess are there differences across different sensory modalities when it comes to memory and imagination?
That's a great question as well. So we know that smell is really evocative when it comes to triggering memories. And I think, yeah, so smells can play a role in kind of prompting you to remember both facts and events in a much bigger way than the other senses. And I did see a study recently that suggested that the decline in memory in later life is kind of interestingly correlated with a decline in the sense of smell. So there are definitely kind of like interesting and unique ways in which smell is involved in memory. Most people, when they talk about their ability to remember events, they characterize that more in terms of visual mental imagery, so in terms of the actual content of what event memory is like. Vision seems to be like really dominantly involved, and that might not be very surprising because we are a visually dominant species. But one interesting thing that comes up when we start to think about the different sensory modalities is just to think, well, we're a visually dominant species, but not all species are visually dominant. So it might be that the other senses are more powerfully involved in memory in other species in interesting ways.
Great, thank you. So a question now about improving memory. David Bauer asks, he says, I've previously had functional memory tests which say I have bad episodic memory. Is there anything I can do to improve this and remember more, or well, more accurately remember more?
Oh, that's a great question. I'm ashamed to say I don't know the answer to that question. But I do know that people tend to remember better things that they have remembered often, which is to say that if you repeatedly kind of remember or talk about or look at photos of some event from your past, you're more likely to remember that event than you are other events that maybe you don't talk about or you don't think about or don't have photos of. So in that sense, you can remember more by kind of rehearsing your memories or having these kind of props or things you can look at or people you can talk about these things with. But that might not necessarily mean that you will remember those things more accurately, because every time you kind of access your episodic memory, a process happens called reconsolidation, which basically means it sort of gets taken apart and put back together again. And every time it gets put back together again, it doesn't necessarily get put back exactly the way it was. And so every time you remember something, you might actually be slightly changing your memory. So by doing that, by kind of re-accessing your memories again and again and looking at pictures and telling stories about things that happened, you might remember more, but you might remember more inaccurately.
Great, thank you. I'm afraid, everyone, we are over time now, but I'm going to try and squeeze in one more question. This comes from Sue Morris, who asks, could imagination and memory be used to heal trauma by reimagining the event?
Oh, that's such a lovely question. And I think the answer to that is potentially yes, for the sorts of reasons that I was just talking about. So every time you access your memory, you make it vulnerable to this kind of reconsolidation and shifting. And so one way potentially to deal with kind of traumatic or intrusive memories would be to kind of access them and then interfere with their reconsolidation. And so one way you could kind of interfere with the reconsolidation of a memory would be to kind of access it, to kind of remember it, but then use your imagination to kind of manipulate it. And then when it gets put back, it might get put back in a slightly different way. Another thing that's related to this that I think is really interesting is that researchers ran a pilot study recently where they were looking at how people could deal with traumatic and intrusive memories. And they found, it was just a small study, but they found some really promising results from getting people to kind of re-access their memories, like maybe write down the bad thing that happened, and then play Tetris for half an hour. And playing Tetris, it also uses similar parts of your brain, similar kind of spatial processing and image processing parts of your brain. And it seems as though playing Tetris while your memory is trying to reconsolidate itself interferes with it in a way that makes it less traumatic and intrusive, which I just think is really cool.
Fantastic. And I think that's all we've got time for. So apologies to everyone who didn't get your question answered, but we received them all and we read them all. So thank you for submitting them. A big thanks to the Leaving Human Trust for funding our research, but a biggest thanks of all today to Ali for her awesome talk.
Thank you so much. And thanks all of you for coming and Henry for chairing. And before you all go, just a quick announcement or advert that if you enjoyed this talk and want to hear more talks on related topics, Henry is actually giving 2 talks as part of the Cambridge Festival. So you should all come along tomorrow to hear Henry give a talk called From Bees to Bots, where he's going to talk about the space of possible minds. And on Saturday, he's going to give a talk called Suffer the Little Robots, which is a talk about the moral and legal status of artificial beings. And I'm sure they will both be excellent.
Awesome, thank you. Sorry, the second one is on Friday.
My bad.
No, thank you very much.
I'm already in bank holiday mode.
No, I appreciate the promo. Well, wonderful. Thanks all again for coming, and I hope you enjoy other talks brought to you by by Cambridge University here as part of the festival. Thanks all.
Thanks.